Welcome back, my Baldur's Gate 3 colleagues. I've got another Baldur's Gate 3 class review for you. Of course, this time we are covering the Warlock. It's the second to last of our series. I cannot believe it. Anyways, Warlock class. Let's dive into it. The Warlock, one of the newest additions to the Dungeons & Dragons core classes. I think the Warlock was introduced in 3.5 edition. Warlock represents, thematically speaking, an Eldritch caster who acquires their magic by making a pact with a terrifying extraplanar being. And your subclass is going to be determined by what kind of extraplanar being you make a pact with. But we'll get to subclasses later. For now, the base class. Let's start, as we always do, with their beginning stats and proficiencies. Warlocks have the 1d8 hit point progression, which is neutral. It's not good, it's not bad. For saving throws, Warlocks get Wisdom and Charisma. Wisdom is a fantastic saving throw, but I slightly prefer Constitution on caster classes like the Warlock is. Nevertheless, Wisdom is great. You never turn down Wisdom. Charisma is probably the worst saving throw in the game. There's just so few things that target Charisma, it's just really forgettable. They also get Light Armor proficiency, which is rare for a caster class. But as we'll see, there are a lot of exceptions that the Warlock gets among arcane casters. Light armor proficiency is good, it's useful to have. They also get simple weapon proficiency, which is also just kind of fine. If you want to be using weapons with your Warlock, which can be good, it's probably best to get weapon proficiencies through your racial selection. Okay, that's base stats and proficiencies. Now let's talk about features. The base class of the Warlock in Baldur's Gate 3 Early Access is distinguished with 3 features. The first is its unique spellcasting progression. It's different than any other class. We'll talk about that. The other core features are its Pact Boon and its Eldritch Invocations. Again, as we level, we'll discuss each of those. We're going to start with spells. Warlocks are like the sorcerer in that they learn very limited spells. I believe they have the same spells known progression as the sorcerer. So you're not getting very many. They also have a unique spell list. It's similar to the wizard and the sorcerer's arcane spell list, but it has some unique spells which are awesome, and we'll discuss those in just a bit. The big difference between Warlock spellcasting and the other arcane casters is Warlocks have very few spell slots. Like, I'm talking very few, 2 to 3 depending on your level. However, these spell slots are always your maximum spell level that you can cast. So, where other classes will have, say, 4 level 1 spells and 3 second level spells, Warlocks will just have 2 to 3 second level spells. That means all spells that they cast are effectively always upcast at the highest spell slot that is available to the Warlock. The other catch is their spell slots refresh on a short rest. That means they are getting more of the highest level spell slots per long rest, more by quite a bit. Remember, you get 2 short rests per long rest in this game. That means if you have 2 second level spell slots, you take your maximum short rest per long rest, you're going to refresh them twice, giving you 6 total second level spell slots. It's the most second level spell slots available in early access, but they don't get first level spell slots, right? It's always at the maximum level. So the way you want to think about the Warlock spellcasting is you want to use a lot of short rests. You always want to get the maximum short rest you can per long rest, and you want to select spells that scale really well when upcast. So we'll talk about that. Now let's look at some of the unique spells and cantrips that Warlocks get. The first one we have to talk about is a cantrip. It's Eldritch Blast. Eldritch Blast is a signature cantrip of the Warlock class. It is a ranged attack cantrip. It's not a save spell. Save spells, as I've been saying, are inherently less accurate and do less damage because they cannot crit. Eldritch Blast isn't one of those, it's an attack spell. It does 1d10 force damage. Force damage is a great damage type. because it is basically never resisted. Awesome. Now, this on its own doesn't seem really good, but there are some features to Eldritch Blast which makes it the best attack cantrip in the game when it's used by Warlocks. One of the features is that there are Eldritch Invocations which are going to augment Eldritch Blast and make it better. And we're going to talk about those when we get to them. The only other thing to discuss with Eldritch Blast is its unique scaling. Most cantrips follow a certain pattern with their damage scaling. At all of the level thresholds where a fighter would get an extra attack, cantrips gain extra damage dice. So fighters get an extra attack at level 5, and if you know a cantrip, at level 5, you will add an extra damage dice to it. So in the case of Eldritch Blast, it's another 1d10. This is inherently worse than the making an extra attack roll. Getting more dice on one attack roll isn't as good as getting more attack rolls, and there are a ton of reasons for that. The main reason is that when you get more attack rolls, you get more hits, and that scales better with abilities that proc on hit. What are some abilities that proc on hit? Well, any of what I call the 4E Striker spells, which we've covered in Hunter's Mark, but Warlocks also get their own version, similar version, which is Hex. Because Warlocks get Hex, they're incentivized to stack more attacks rather than more damage on their attacks. Eldritch Blast is the only cantrip that scales. As it scales, it gives you more attacks. Unlike other cantrips, when you reach level 5 with Eldritch Blast, you get an extra bolt. That bolt is its own separate attack roll. It can target the same target as another bolt or a different one, and if it hits, it deals damage as normal. This scales so well with Hex, which adds 1d6 damage on a hit. It also scales well with an Eldritch Invocation we're going to look at that allows us to add attribute modifiers to Eldritch Blast hits. Yeah, it's a fantastic scaling cantrip, especially with the Warlock, but all of that is actually moot because in early access we can't get to level 5. We're stuck at level 4, so we don't get to see the awesome scaling of Eldritch Blast, and that's a shame, but I think it's worth mentioning because we won't be stuck in early access forever. As soon as we get to level 5, Eldritch Blast is going to really start outcompeting the other attack cantrips. And then besides Eldritch Blast, you just get a lot of cantrips that are the same as the Sorcerer or the Wizard. So all of the discussion that we've had on those videos are relevant here. I usually take Blade Ward on my Warlocks because it functions really well with another Warlock unique level 1 spell. So let's go over to the level 1 spells. For level 1 spells, you can see you get a somewhat limited spell selection, but with some unique spells. Let's talk about the unique ones. First, we talked about Hex actually. So Hex is like the Warlock's version of Hunter's Mark, only it does 1d6 necrotic damage, and it also imposes disadvantage on ability checks for enemies. That's not super useful. A lot of people confuse this with saving throws. It's not imposing disadvantage on saving throws, it's imposing disadvantage on ability checks. Ability checks are like skill checks. For example, you make an athletic skill check to avoid being shoved. You make a dexterity stealth skill check when you try to hide. That's a skill check. So if you hex someone's strength, you're going to be more accurate in your attempts to shove them. If you hex someone's dexterity before a fight, they're going to have disadvantage on their initiative roll. But other than that, you don't get a really consistent use out of hexing ability checks. Oh, I forgot. Hexing wisdom will give them disadvantage on perception checks to see you if you're trying to hide, so that's another use. Mostly, it's about doing that 1d6 necrotic damage on hit. Okay, that's Hex. Now, Armor of Agathis. This is one of my favorite spells in the game. Armor of Agathis kind of coats you with a frost armor, and the armor is represented by your temporary hit points. However, when enemies attack you with a melee attack, that armor is going to freeze them and do a little bit of cold retaliation damage. How it works is, anytime someone hits you with a melee attack, while you still have the temporary hit points granted to you from Armor of Agathis, they take a flat amount of cold damage and retaliation. At level 1, when you cast this spell at level 1, you gain 5 temporary hit points, and you deal 5 cold damage. And this iteration of the spell is terrible. I mean, think about it. Most enemies will average above 5 damage on a hit, right? So with this, you are tanking 1 hit, 5 damage, and you're going to, on that hit that you tank, retaliate with 5 cold damage, giving you a net total of 5 damage / hit points in a swing, right? It's saving you 5, it's dealing 5, that's 10 total. However, when the spell gets really good is when you start upcasting it, because when it's upcast at a 2nd level spell slot, it adds another 5 to your temporary hit points and another 5 damage on the retaliation. So now you'll have 10 temporary hit points, and you'll do 10 damage when enemies hit you with melee attacks. And notice how there's the scaling in the damage, but also in how many hits the shield will tank. Do you see what I'm getting at here? It's much more rare for an enemy to average above 10 damage on their melee hits. So it's possible that this shield will tank 2 hits, in which case you're now getting 2 procs of the cold damage, which is now also 10 instead of 5. It absorbs 10 hit points, it retaliates twice, that's 10, 10, 10, 30 total, as compared to the 10 that it was doing in level 1. So it's double again the efficiency just by upcasting it a single level spell slot. In early access, of course, we are capped at 2nd level spells, but you can imagine how good it gets when you're upcasting at level 3, level 4, level 5 spell slots. It goes up by iterations of 5 each time. Fantastic spell when upcast, and upcasting spells is kind of the Warlock's thing. Another thing I need to mention is all of the interactions with Armor of Agathys that can make it better. I mentioned before Blade Ward, which makes you resistant to physical damage, effectively doubling your hit points. That means doubling the amount of hits that you can tank that will proc the retaliation damage, right? So using Armor of Agathys with Blade Ward not only gives you some defensive bonuses, it also actually gives you more retaliation damage from Armor of Agathys. It's a fantastic combo. Also, Armor of Agathys does cold damage, which is doubled against wet targets from Create Water. So an upcast Armor of Agathys that is retaliating against a target that's wet will do 20 cold damage. 20. That's an absurd amount of damage. There's no to hit roll. It's just if they hit you. Absolutely fantastic. One of the S-tier spells in the game because of its scaling, and we can only expect it to do better as we have more levels for it to scale. Next, let's talk about a fire damage equivalent or competitor to Armor of Agathys, which is Hellish Rebuke. Hellish Rebuke does 2d10 fire damage, and it uses your reaction to cast. If a target hits you, you sacrifice your reaction, you do 2d10 fire damage, and it's a save spell. It'll do half as much damage if they succeed on a dexterity saving throw. This is actually a much better spell when cast at level 1. In fact, it's one of the most efficient spells when cast with a level 1 spell slot, mostly because of its very low action cost. Reactions are so seldom used, as I've said before, so getting anything on a reaction is great. And 2d10 fire damage is a lot of damage. Also, unlike Armor of Agathys, this will retaliate against ranged targets, not just melee. So I sometimes prefer to use Hellish Rebuke instead of Armor of Agathys on my ranged Warlock builds, which are the most common Warlock builds, since you're incentivized to use Eldritch Blast with a Warlock. That's Hellish Rebuke. The only other unique spell to cover is Arms of Hadar. Now, I have a controversial take on Arms of Hadar. I rank it RP tier. I just think it's worthless. It's absolutely not worth casting. Arms of Hadar does 2d6 necrotic damage to all enemies within 5 meters of you. Also, those enemies that are hit can take reactions. However, it's a save spell. They make a strength saving throw, and if they succeed, they take half damage, and they don't lose their reaction. Why use this spell? Well, do you use it for damage? No. 2d6 damage is really low. It's one of the worst damaging spells in early access so far. I'm serious. Just do the math. You have to hit several targets to make it worth it compared to other damaging spells. And remember, you have to put yourself in harm's way, in melee range, to target enemies with this. So I don't think it's useful to use as a damage spell. Like, if you want to be damaging people at melee range, just use Armor of Agathis, right? So the only real niche that's left for Arms of Hadar is as an escape spell, right? If enemies close in on you, this is one of the few ways to do an area of effect cancellation of their reactions, which will then allow you to run away without proccing an attack of opportunity. But here's the problem. When you're in a situation when you're surrounded, you need something that is reliable. And a strength save spell is never reliable. You won't reliably hit it on all of the targets. Whereas if you just take the disengage action, sure, you don't do any damage, but who cares about the damage? It's such a minuscule amount of damage anyways. Just take the disengage as your action and run away, and then next turn do something that will deal damage instead of being dead. I just think Arms of Hadar isn't good. Now, I've mentioned before Brycon, a friend of this channel and a fellow YouTuber who reviews spells. He actually likes Arms of Hadar. So if you also find it useful, check out his videos and maybe listen to his arguments about it. But I don't find his arguments persuasive. I still rank it RP tier. I don't think it's very good. But that's okay, because there are so many awesome spells for Warlocks to choose from. Armor of Agathis, Hex, Hellish Rebuke. Amazing. Alright, that's it for level 1. Let's go on to further levels to see the Warlock class features. So there are 2 more features left to discuss with the Warlock base class. They are Invocations, which they get at level 2, and then there are its Pact features, which they get at level 3. So here we are at level 2. Let's look at Invocations. Invocations, I think it's kind of an odd name. They're really powers, or at least that's how I see them. They are powers kind of like superpowers from comic books that either augment a Warlock's spells or augment the Warlock themselves. So there are tons of options, and we get to pick 2 at level 2, but we'll be able to pick more later. And usually the list expands at higher levels. But, in early access, it's just the 2 that we get from this list. We'll go through the list one by one, and then I'm just going to highlight the ones that I consider really game-changing. So, first, Agonizing Blast. With this invocation, this augments your Eldritch Blast. Now, when you cast the cantrip Eldritch Blast, you add your Charisma modifier to the damage it deals, unless your Charisma modifier is negative, which it shouldn't be if you're making a Warlock. So this turns Eldritch Blast into like a weapon attack. You add your ability modifier to the damage. Like I was saying, most cantrips don't do that, and it's a big reason why they fall behind standard weapon attacks for damage. So that's Agonizing Blast. Armor of Shadows. This gives you the Mage Armor spell, which you can cast at will without expending a spell slot. So effectively, it gives you Mage Armor as permanent armor that you can wear. Mage Armor is equivalent to a +1 studded leather armor, which is good armor. It's really good armor in the early game, like we're playing in early access, and it stays relevant if you play kind of by the standard rules for 5th edition magical items. That stays relevant for most of your campaign, up into the high levels. So that's Armor of Shadows. Beast Speech. You can cast Speak with Animals at will without expending a spell slot. Pretty cool. No real combat use here, but speaking with animals is fun. Beguiling Influence. With this, you can invoke your patron's Bewitching Charm. You gain proficiency in Deception and Persuasion, so it's a skill boost. Next up is Devil's Sight. You can see normally in darkness, both magical and non-magical, to a distance of 24 meters. So it's like getting superior dark vision with the added benefit of being able to see through magical darkness as well. Fiendish Vigor is next. This allows you to cast False Life on yourself at will as a level 1 spell. That's as a level 1 spell, it gives you 7 temporary hit points. And it doesn't cost a spell slot. So, I said it gives you 7, but it says it gives you 5 here. I'm pretty sure it was 7, but let's just trust what it's saying in the tooltip. It gives you 5. That's Fiendish Vigor. Mask of Many Faces. This allows you to cast Disguise Self at will. Again, doesn't have really any combat use, but a ton of roleplay value. Repelling Blast. This also augments your Eldritch Blast. And what it does is when you cast Eldritch Blast and you hit, you can push the creature up to 4.5 meters away from you. That's Repelling Blast. Thief of 5 Fates. This gives you a spell, but unlike the others, you can't cast it at will. It's just 1 cast per long rest, and it allows you to cast the spell Bane as a level 1 spell. Bane is the debuff alternative to the Bless spell. So it does the same thing as Bless, except in debuff form. It means they receive a 1d4 penalty to their attack rolls and their saving throw. And it is a charisma save to resist. Okay. Now, I can't talk about most of these. It'll take too long. I will just say several of these, as I mentioned, are really just roleplay value. So take it if you feel like it will help you get that, it'll help realize the character that you have in your mind. So I won't say many more about these. There's lots of decent ones that I would say aren't bad, but they kind of get outcompeted by other options. Armor of Shadows is one of them. Being able to cast Mage Armor at will is great, but I usually have a wizard in my party that can cast Mage Armor, and eventually you will get armor that's better than this. So it doesn't feel like it's a good use of an invocation, but it's also not a bad use of an invocation. Fiendish Vigor is the same way. I thought it was 7 temporary hit points. 5 is worse, obviously. It's just not a lot of temporary hit points, and it costs an action to cast it in combat, so you really just use it between combats. Over several encounters, it will add up to a lot of temporary hit points. So it's not a bad pick, but there are better picks. And again, Thief of 5 Fates is the same way. Bane is a great spell. The problem is that it uses your concentration, so it's competing for concentration with spells like Hex, which I feel are better. And it's once per long rest, which is just not enough casts of Bane to be useful. But then again, it's not bad. Like, you can pick it and you'll get use out of it. Bane is a great spell. So let me highlight the ones that I think are really the best options. The obvious one is Agonizing Blast. It almost feels mandatory for the Warlock. I mean, Eldritch Blast is already a great spell. This is making it the best attack cantrip by far. And then what really makes it strong is when you scale up past level 4 and your cantrip starts scaling. Remember I said Eldritch Blast scales uniquely among cantrips in that it gives you more blasts. And this adds your charisma modifier to each blast. So you're just like attacks, you're able to multiply that base attribute modifier on your damage. And this really allows Warlocks to compete with other striker builds. This is kind of what makes them a striker class, honestly. Yeah, Agonizing Blast, fantastic. It's really hard not to pick this one. The only time I don't pick it is when I'm planning on a melee Warlock build, but melee Warlock builds are frankly worse. I think you should think of Warlocks as primarily ranged strikers. And that's mostly because of this power, Agonizing Blast. Devil's Sight is the other really good one, especially now that they've implemented it properly. It's really difficult for other classes to be able to see, to get superior dark vision, and then it's extremely rare to be able to get superior dark vision that works in magical darkness. In both melee and range builds, this allows you to basically guarantee advantage on attacks. By being in a dark space, you can attack out of that dark space without disadvantage because you can see normally with Devil's Sight. But enemies attacking you, you're heavily obscured now, which means they have disadvantage on attacks against you, and they automatically fail wisdom perception checks that you make when you go to hide, so you're getting advantage through that as well. You can cast spells like darkness and duck, or fog cloud, duck in and out of them. Yeah, it's just it means you seldom miss. That's what this means. You can use darkness to boost your defense and also your offense. So yeah, to me, Agonizing Blast and Devil's Sight are the go-to. However, one that kind of competes with Devil's Sight is Repelling Blast. Again, tons of tactical uses here. Being able to push people away is really good, especially with the vertical encounter design that Larian has implemented in this game. Pushing people doesn't just mean kiting for you, although it does mean that. It also means pushing people off of cliffs for bonus damage. So it's a really tough pick between Repelling Blast and Devil's Sight. I think maybe Devil's Sight wins out a bit for me, but not enough. It just matters how you use these. One way to get kind of the best of both worlds is just to play a Drow Warlock, and they get superior dark vision already. It doesn't work in magical darkness, but that is a more niche bonus. So you can get that superior dark vision through your Drow heritage and then pick Repelling Blast. It's one of the reasons why Drow make some of the best Warlocks in the game. But yeah, those are the 3 invocations that I think are the most worth picking. Now let's move on to your Pact bonuses. So here we are at level 3, where the Warlock gets its last base class feature, which is its Pact Boon. Pact Boons are bonuses that you get that kind of, flavor-wise, represent the kind of pact that you've signed with your higher power. Now, on full release, we can expect you to have 3 options of Pact Boon. They are Pact of the Chain, Pact of the Blade, and Pact of the Tome. And basically what these 3 options give you is Pact of the Chain is like a summoning build, Pact of the Blade is like a melee striking build, and Pact of the Book is like a spellcasting control build. That's in general their flavor. None of them are major bonuses, but they are bonuses, right? However, in early access, Larian has only implemented one of these Pact Boons, and that is Pact of the Chain. This allows you to summon a familiar, like the Summon Familiar spell, only you can cast it at will. And there are 2 unique familiar options that you have, the Imp and the Quasit, that aren't available to other casters casting Find Familiar. And of course, these 2 options are going to be better than your standard Find Familiar options. At least they are in BG3. So let's take a look at these ones, starting with the Quasit. So here I have summoned the Quasit, and we can look at its stats. It has 7 hit points, which obviously is not very many. 13 armor class, that is low. So at a glance, it doesn't seem like it's very useful for tanking, but it's actually tankier than you would expect, and that's because of its resistances. If we scroll down to resistances, you can see it's resistant to fire, lightning, and cold damage, 3 very common types, particularly fire, and it's resistant to all physical damage. So under most conditions, this 7 hit points is more like 14. And remember, you can summon this Quasit at will, which means you're always refreshing its hit points after every fight, and absolutely it benefits from the aid spell if you have a cleric in your party, which you should. That's giving it another 5, which it's doubling to 10. You get the idea. It's actually fairly tanky, especially for familiars, but even for other summons, like the summons on the Beastmaster Ranger, it can kind of compete with some of the tankier options there. So yeah, I do treat Quasits, and we'll see the Imp, as kind of like tanks. I like tanking hits with them, because if they die, I don't have to resurrect them. I can just resummon them after the fight. So they're great for that. Use them to absorb hits. Other features that the Quasit gets, it of course gets Dark Vision up to 12 meters. And it gets certain powers, which we can see in its action tooltip down here. One is the invisibility spell, which it can cast once per long rest. Actually, I think it can cast this at will. And invisibility is invisibility. It makes you unseen until your next action against an enemy target. And it will give you advantage on that attack against the enemy target, or disadvantage on their skill check if you're like shoving them or something. And then Quasits get this ability, Scare. Scare frightens targets in an area around the Quasit. It refreshes every short rest, but basically, since you're resummoning this anyways, even if it was long rest, all of the features are between encounters, because you're going to resummon this every encounter. The DC on the Scare, however, is only 10. That's not very high, but some targets will roll ones and fail on that check, in which case they're scared for as long as you maintain concentration. Rather, they're frightened. Frightened creatures have disadvantage on ability checks and attack rolls, so that's a good condition to impose. That is... Oh, and its basic attack is 1d4 plus 3, and it does benefit from proficiency bonus, plus 2 on its proficiency bonus to its attack rolls, so it's attacking at a plus 5. That's the Quasit. Now let's look at the Imp. Now, I find the Imp a little better than the Quasit. Let's take a look here. It has 10 hit points rather than 7, and it benefits from most of the same resistances. The important ones, of course, fire, cold, and physical damage. It's resistant to those. So under most conditions, you will be doubling that 10 hit points to 20. It has the same armor class of 13. It's actually immune to poison damage. And poison damage is very common. There are lots of enemies that try to poison you in this game. Spiders do poison damage. There are humanoid enemies that will dip their weapons in poison. There is a fight against a particular fey creature. I don't want to spoil it. But this creature will spam Ray of Sickness, which does poison damage. You get the idea. Honestly, I think poison might be the most common damage type. Maybe fire is more common, I'm not sure, but both of them are very common. So being immune to poison, wow, that's actually quite good. Making the Imp tankier than you would think. It also gets Dark Vision, but it also gets Devil's Sight, which means it sees normally in darkness, both magical and non-magical, which is hard to use since it doesn't have a ranged attack, but still nifty. What else? It can cast invisibility, just like the Quasit. And then it gets this Sting ability, where it can attack with its Stinger. It's just a normal attack. It has a plus 5 to hit. If it hits, it does 1d4 plus 3 piercing damage. Enemies must make a DC 11 save. I believe it's a Constitution save. And if they fail, they take 1d6 poison damage, so there's a chance of a little bit added damage. And then finally, Imps get a bonus action Fly, making them rather maneuverable. So both Quasit and Imps are good. The advantage of the Quasit is that it can scare enemies, and because it's an area of effect, even with the DC 10, you can expect to scare one or two enemies. It's just not really reliable to get it on the target that you want. The Imp is slightly tankier, slightly more mobile, and does slightly more damage. And so for that reason, I favor the Imp, but both are good options. And don't forget, you don't have to choose one. Like, if you choose one, you're not stuck with it. You can resummon these guys. So if you're in a fight where there's going to be lots of enemies, like, say, in a goblin camp, and you expect them to have low saves against the frightened attack, then the Quasit, you can just summon the Quasit instead, and it's going to be good. So summons are always good in BG3, and that makes the Pact of the Chain a really good option. Alright, that is it for the Warlock base class. Now let's talk about the rankings. So the Warlock is such an interesting class to rank because it does a lot. It does a lot, right? I mean, invocations, spells, its unique kind of spells that are always upcast and refreshed on a short rest. It gets summons. Summons are really good because that's just more actions that you can take. And if you think about all these things together, it really starts to seem like you should give this class an S. It just gets a lot of useful things. And that might be the correct way to think about it. Maybe they are an S-based class. I have troubles giving them an S though, and that is because of their lack of synergy with other classes. I find that Warlocks are really good units, but they don't become much better when you combine them with others. They don't benefit a lot from the free crits because they're not really, that you can get from like sleep and stuff. They don't benefit a lot from that because they're not really melee strikers. They function really well in darkness, but it's hard to build a whole team around functioning in darkness, which means they want to kind of be off by themselves, working in darkness while the rest of your team is in light, and it creates an awkward dyssynergy that they have with the rest of the team. So I find adding a Warlock to your team, it's not really multiplicative. It's a big boost, but it's just a flat boost. It doesn't make the rest of your team better, and it's not made better by the rest of your team. So for that reason, I give the Warlock base class an A, but they are really strong, and they get a lot of awesome features as we've talked about. So A tier is still really good too. They're a great class. Now let's look at the Warlock's subclasses. Okay, so here we are back at level 1 in character creation, where we select our subclass for the Warlock. In early access, we have access to 2 subclasses. They are the Fiend Pact and the Great Old One Pact. Now, even though there's technically 2, there's really only one option, because obviously Larian's had some troubles implementing the features that the Great Old One Pact gets in tabletop, because they haven't included most of the features that they should get. It's really not implemented. So why don't we just cover it now to get it out of the way. Right now, when you pick Great Old One, you get your bonus spells. Both of the subclasses will get bonus spells, which they may choose from. Okay? Unlike the bonus spells in a Cleric, which you always have access to and have learned, bonus spells from Warlock packs enter the pool of spells that you may select, but you don't always have access to them, only if you select them. The Great Old One spell selections are Tasha's Hideous Laughter and Dissonant Whispers. Both of these are good spells. Tasha's Hideous Laughter is a very good spell. So if there were other features that the Great Old One got, it might be worth taking for Tasha's Hideous Laughter and the other features, but at level 3, you also get access to Detect Thoughts, which is a totally role-playing spell. It has no use in combat that I know of. So just overall, the Great Old One is incomplete. I rank it RP tier because it's always better to pick the Fiend Pact. So let's just go to the Fiend Pact now. The Fiend Pact will get 2 features. It gets its bonus spells at level 1 and level 3, and then it will get Dark One's Blessing. Let's talk about its bonus spells first, though. At level 1, Fiend Pact Warlocks get access to Burning Hands and Command. I rank both of these spells as B tier. They're what I would call consistently average. Like, you'll get a lot of use out of these spells, but what they do is not very impactful, and that's why I give them a B tier ranking. I would definitely take them on the Fiend Warlock, only there are so many S tier spells we have left that we need to pick first, and Warlocks just don't get that many spells to select. Like, I'm not going to take Burning Hands over Armor of Agathis. I'm not going to take Command over Hex. You get the idea. Mostly, I just don't use either Burning Hands or Command on the Fiend Warlock. However, at level 2, I'm not going to skip ahead, I'll just tell you. At level 2, they get access to Blindness and Scorching Ray. And Scorching Ray is absolutely an S tier spell that you want on your Fiend Warlock. Why? Scorching Ray fires 3 bolts, each do damage, each have their own attack roll. You can make them hit one target or multiple targets, it doesn't matter, as long as the targets are within range. This synergizes so well with the Warlock exclusive Hex, because every hit is doing an extra 1d6 necrotic damage. Combining Hex with Scorching Ray effectively increases the damage of Scorching Ray by 33%, and Scorching Ray already did a lot of damage to start with. It's an absolute shredder of a single target combo, and it's extremely fun to use. So if you're playing a Fiend Warlock, maybe Will, I spend most of my casts on Hex and then Scorching Ray. It's a little one-dimensional, but it's actually very powerful. That is the bonus spells for the Fiend Warlock. Let's talk about its feature, Dark One's Blessing. Dark One's Blessing you get at level 1. It is a passive feature that's always on, so to speak. What happens is, when you reduce a hostile creature, that is an enemy, to 0 hit points, that's just a fancy way to say, if you kill an enemy, this gifts you 3 plus your level in temporary hit points. So it's going to give you a shield worth 7 hit points at level 4 every time you kill a target. Warlocks are a striker class, so they should be killing targets often. This gives you a fair amount of durability. It's not a game-changing feature by any means, like this isn't going to make you into a tank. It just means that you can catch a few stray arrows and you'll be fine. So what do I rank the Fiend Warlock? I give the Fiend Warlock a B tier ranking. Dark One's Blessing is nice, Scorching Ray is nice, but Scorching Ray is something I think they should probably just get anyways, because they're an arcane caster. You know, other arcane caster classes just get it as part of their base class, right? It's not really a selling point for a subclass. So that's B tier for the Fiend Warlock. And that's it for the Warlock class. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please consider subscribing. I'm at a point in the growth of this channel where subscribers really matter, so I would appreciate it if you subscribe. Whether you do or don't, please join me next week when we cover the final class on our class tier list, the Wizard. I'll see you guys then.